I'm moderating 2 sessions. Great. Our sound check is ready. Everyone can hear me okay in the back? Juliette, we're going to fill this audience. We're going to fill it, but not yet. At least online, it'll be a good turnout. They're going to get you a sound check. Great. If you're comfortable with it, I think that's maybe easier. They'll come. I can be on mute. If you're okay with that sound. Juliette, Torabian is a recognized expert. Susanna. We're streaming, but we're going to say hello. Streaming on the internet. so thrilled you're here.
Bienvenidos a todos los invitados. Estamos encantados de estar aquí. Vamos a presentar la primera charla Hed. Soy Luxembourg, soy el moderador de hoy de UNESCO Bangkok, que voy a presentar a la doctora Juliette Torabian, una reconocida experta en desarrollo sostenible, en educación, en Asia, África, Europa, en la aplicación de proyectos regionales y nacionales de acceso, inclusión e igualdad en los sistemas educativos. Es líder de equipo adjunto del proyecto Pioneer y estudia prácticas de la educación y las desigualdades. Es autora de Wealth, Values, Culture and Education, Revivir los esenciales para la sostenibilidad. Juliette, bienvenida. Gracias. La cuestión de hoy es muy directa. ¿La educación superior está condenada al fracaso por las desigualdades? Es una pregunta muy importante y vamos a intentar encontrar una respuesta al final de la sesión. Como ven, las desigualdades están en el meollo de la cuestión que estoy planteando. ¿Cuándo fue la última vez que escucharon educación y desigualdades, que trabajaron en la educación y las desigualdades? O en la primera parte de la pregunta, educación y desigualdades. Si vamos a la segunda parte, estoy convencida de que hay muchísimas experiencias solo en esta sala y mucho más en la conferencia. Yo puedo compartir mi respuesta. La educación y las desigualdades han marcado mi trayectoria en los últimos 25 años, empezando por la educación primaria de adultos, la educación de calidad, la entrada en el desarrollo internacional, cuando la educación para todos se puso en marcha en el año 2000, asesora.
Managing multi-stakeholder projects for equality, inclusion and access, drafting, designing toolkits, training teachers, lecturing at universities, and now, more recently, as the deputy team leader of a European-funded project called Pioneer that I'm going to introduce to you later. Regardless of our differences and similarities in the experiences that we have with educational inequalities, there is one recent moment in history that we all shared the experiences about educational inequalities, not only us, people working in the field of education, but everyone else. And that was during COVID. And when we reverted suddenly to panicagogy, where we were delivering online fast food kind of courses online just because we didn't have any other choices and we were in panic. This is where many of the divides that until then remained invisible were manifest. Digital divide was one. It affected 3.7 billion people around the world, including 800 million young people. Gender inequality that we have worked so hard to eradicate was also there. It affected girls who were married off. It affected girls who were married off in some African countries because they were not in school anymore. And in Europe, 11.8% of young men and 8% of young women left university in 2020. Socioeconomic divide was also there, and it affected many of our university students around the world, but also in Europe, who didn't have access to food, accommodation, and decent jobs. There was also the divide between global south and north that we already knew about, which meant only 29% of universities in Africa were able to deliver online courses during the confinement, compared to 85% in Europe. All these divides made us rethink and question the progress that we have made, or not, in inclusion and fairness. So what was really the role of higher education in this age of sustainable development if all these inequalities still persisted and were even exaggerated by the pandemic? What was the role of higher education? So let us go to talk about the role of higher education. What is it that we expect from higher education? Well, I'd say, and based on my experience working in higher education, policy and practice, it's a combination of expecting higher education to be the Sleeping Beauty, arriving suddenly in higher education, leaving all the disadvantages that she has accumulated in informal and formal education before, Harry Potter and his magic stick to suddenly shift our pedagogies, our institutional cultures, our curriculum, our teaching methodologies, so that our students wouldn't be just another brick in the wall of our societies, and of course to graduate, get employed, and live happily ever after. That's what we expect from our higher education institutions. To top it all up, after the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals, there is something else that we want higher education to do. We want higher education to take this and to give us this. Well, the reality is different and far away from what we expect from higher education. Let us have a look at these things. We know by fact and by research that socioeconomic background, parental education, gender and sexual identity, migration background, language, age, ethnic group, all these are elements that affect access, uptake, and completion across the whole way and life of education, and also in higher education. I'll give you some examples. In Europe, for example, we know for the fact that students whose fathers have higher level of education are more present in higher education compared to those whose fathers do not have high level of education. There's an exception, and that is Spain, where we have 40% of blue-collar students in higher education, but that is because the whole system of education from early years is more equitable compared to a place, for example, like Germany, where we have tracking, or Luxembourg. Migration background is another thing that affects educational equality. We know for the fact, and by research, that in several European countries, including Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, for example, foreign-born students outnumber their native-born colleagues in higher education. This is reversed in Greece, for example, where 9.3% of foreign-born students drop out of higher education. That's another fact. Well, we have the gender differences. That is a global phenomenon. But also in Europe, we have data that shows girls outnumber boys at bachelor's and master's level and in social sciences, and boys outnumber girls in the STEM fields and at doctoral level. That's another fact that we have. I'm sure I'm not breaking news to you. These are all known, at least to us, people working in the field of education. And so because these inequalities have existed and persisted, we have tried to undo them through policies and practices. At least in Europe from 1960s and 1970s, when there was the massification of higher education, we have gone towards adapting policies and practices that could undo these inequalities. What is it that we have done? We have focused on two main sorts of policies and practices. One has focused on access, so we have been obsessed with quantity of people from different disadvantaged groups to be able to access, so that is about quantity, inequality in quantity that we wanted to address. And then equal opportunities, so learning, skills, competencies, graduation, all of that, to be equal for everyone in higher education. I'd say these are business as usual. And I say we need to transform our perceptions, policies, practices, and our participation in decision-making in higher education in order to undo educational inequalities. Inequality in higher education is not a singular, one-time event. It is not. It is accumulated through the life course and from early childhood education. We cannot undo it at the level of higher education. It has to be a life course, policy and practice. Inequality in higher education is also not a one-dimensional incident. It happens at the intersection of informal and formal education, families' resources, choices, but also the formal structure of our education systems that tends to reproduce those with higher cultural capital. And it is intersectional. It means we can accumulate advantages and disadvantages, like when at the crossroad of gender, age, ethnicity, or any other one of these characteristics. And there is no best policy or practice. There is no best policy or practice. A best policy or practice that works in a context works there because of the particular dynamics of that context at micro level, meso level, institutional I mean, and macro level. That is why it works there. It cannot work anywhere else. I am glad that much research has been done on all these topics that I just evoked here. And that in Pioneered, which is a project that University of Luxembourg is leading, we are building on all these researches that already exist at European level. We are bringing 13 universities and 9 countries with different contexts together in order to map, identify, understand, analyze pioneering policies and practices tackling educational inequalities. The word that you see there is pioneering. It is not the best. Why? Because we want to understand these practices and policies in the context where they are practiced or where they are formulated, and not as a best practice that we can suddenly take, adapt, and give it to someone else. Context is very much important in the formulation of discourses, in the recognition of inequalities, how intersectional they are, and what they are all about. We are also adapting a brand new, innovative approach, and that is the MILK approach. I'm going to explain it. It stands for Multi-Level Intersectional Life Course Approach. So what is it that we are trying to do? We understand educational inequalities, as I said, is a life course trajectory. and that advantages and disadvantages are accumulated, as you can see, from early childhood education to tertiary education, and at the crossroad of formal and informal education. I see you were taking photos. Should I stop? No. We are also going for a multi-level analysis, understanding that educational inequalities, well, we have different levels of schooling. It doesn't happen at transitions from one level of a school to the other, but is accumulated throughout. Also, that it is at the level of policy discourse, and we have done fabulous research on that, at the level of institutional practice and understandings of teachers, individual understanding of the students, of their attitudes, of their behavior, and what they want from their education. So there are multi-levels. And we have also not forgotten about intersectionality. Any one of these elements that you see here can combine and create even harsher inequalities, disadvantages, or advantages for different groups. This is the approach that we are taking. We launched this research program a year ago. In this first year, we have mapped policies, perceptions, and we have analyzed how, in every context, educational inequalities and groups are formulated. We are now at the second stage, the second year, we have recently started, and we are now going to go to our stakeholders without objectifying them, but involving them in our research, in order to understand what they think, within the context of their countries, is pioneering, which means transforming towards educational equality. Well, let us go back to the first question. After all these things that I just discussed, are we really doomed with inequalities in higher education? What do you think? I'd say yes, and I'm sorry to say that, because of all the explanations that I gave you. But let us take a stock of what is available. We have SDGs, SDG 4, for education at international level, and I'm happy to say between 2012 and 2015, many of us lobbied, advocated for integration of higher education in development goals, and eventually it was integrated. It remains a little bit limited because it focuses on the scholarships mostly, but we were happy to have it as part of the SDGs, okay? International development and initiatives that are there to protect us from inequalities, all right? Then we have, at regional levels, different regions, and I'm focusing on European level. Again, we have policies, initiatives, and an increasing attention to educational inequalities and funding for researchers that are innovative, like the one that we are leading at University of Luxembourg. And of course, at institutional level, where academics and the students are trying to tackle educational inequalities. But reports on SDG and SDG 4 is saying that we are not going to achieve our goals by 2030 with the speed that we are going. Reports from and data from European level says that research is there, but it is not yet translated into policies and practices to understand educational inequalities as a life course, multi-level, intersectional incident. And practices and pedagogies in our universities are still to be sustainable. So I say we need to step up our efforts in this post-pandemic era, and that for pioneering for fairness and inclusion, we need to integrate a new understanding of inequalities within a multi-level, intersectional, and life course understanding, and to change our perceptions, policies, practices, and participation. What I'm hoping to do next time we meet are two things. One, to be able to report on our project and say, yes, we were able to do this research and transfer it to the European regional authorities so that they would integrate it into policies and practices. This is the first thing that I really want to do next time we meet. The second thing is that I would like to start my talk by asking you, have you ever heard about educational equality? And then you would say, seriously? She asked the same question last time we met. Of course we heard it in the title of your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliette. That was outstanding. We'll just take a seat. I think we have about 15 minutes, so if you have questions from the audience, this is your time. And online, we encourage you to throw in your questions for Juliette. We want this to be an interactive discussion as much as possible. So if there's microphones and questions, please raise your hand. But I'm so grateful you started the World Higher Education Conference with divides, with not allowing us to slip through 3 days of the same. This has to be this transformation. Can you tell us more about these starting points that you see? Because I thought you were brilliant on this point about the need to understand our local context. What would you say for some of the starting points looking at other regions and countries around the world?
Well, thank you for your question. From my experience, I see there are global traits of inequalities that are shared across contexts. But that doesn't mean that we can take one policy or practice from one context and take it to the other one and think that we are going to have miracles happening. That is what is wrong. Because beneath best practices, there is this idea of efficiency and effectiveness. And it is very managerial, let's say. That is what we do not really need in higher education. We need a change in the way we think about the role of higher education from what it has become as an economic entity and put it back in its social, political role, in fact. And to be able to understand that higher education is not a starting point to change or to subvert all the inequalities that have accumulated throughout the life course of a student. We need to have an integrative approach to our policies and practices from the very beginning of early childhood to higher education. That is one way that we can. And also to understand that informal education plays a very important role. We do not have enough research or data because it is very hard and difficult to get information from informal contexts, but it needs to be integrated, and I'm really happy that in Pioneer it is the first time that we are in fact integrating that part into our research. I mean, think about it. Your parents' choice resources do have an impact on where you study, what you study, if you have access or you do not have access. The family's cultural capital has an impact. And we cannot satisfy ourselves by exceptions that happen, because those exceptions, I think, prove the rule.
I think that's true. Even the exceptions of us being able to get online and join this conference or to fly to this event and be part of this discussion about inequality. And we try to do our best about being inclusive. But I'd love to hear from the audience because I have more questions on migration and other topics that you brought up. 2 or 3 questions from the audience if you want to raise your hand and we can give you a mic. Sure, in the back. And we have a mic coming to you. And here it is. Other questions? Feel free to raise your hand. We'll take maybe 2 if we have time.
Thank you so much, Juliette. Nadine Zacharias, Swinburne University in Australia, Melbourne. Thank you so much for this talk and for really starting us off with a big picture. You asked the question early on, what is the role of higher education in society? So I'd like to pick up on the idea you have just raised, right? So we can't start with the universities, we have to start much further down the track. But what is the role of universities in starting that conversation? And, you know, like raising awareness that we really have to work right across the education system, that, you know, there's only so much we can do at the level that a young person enters university, but as institutions, how can we progress that discourse, that we need to start much earlier?
Maybe one more question if we could?
Yes,
and then,
please.
If it's
Yes.
okay? In the back on the right, and then we'll go to a response, and then yes, 2 more. Feel free to keep them coming. We'd love to keep this as long as we go, in about 15 more minutes. There in the back, on the right. Yeah, thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Anantha Duryappa. I come from the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute from Delhi. I wanted to kind of bring in the work of Daniel Markovits and Peter Mandler in terms of the thing that really drives, and unfortunately I think it's a negative drive, in the way we assess students. So meritocracy, which has been touted as the great equalizer, has actually backfired. And I think you alluded in your final statements, I apologize, I came in a bit late, but in terms of those initial conditions for kids are so important. Your family background, the kind of nudging that happens throughout, and that's not equalized across all students, so some of them have that disadvantage. So there is no really a bad student. It's a student who has not been offered.
True.
So how do we change this notion of using credentials and meritocracy as the basis of evaluation? And can we actually talk about inequity? I don't like to use the word equality, because I think there are 2 very distinct distinctions. And I think equity is a lot, because it takes into consideration each one's personal endowments and attributes.
Mm-hmm.
How do we change that system, which is so focused on this very competitive way of assessing and is pitting against each other? Your ranking is a problem, again. But that's how we that seems the only way we know how to do it. And is that something that you are looking at and addressing in your research?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Over to Juliette for those 2 questions, if that's comfortable.
Yes, I think there was a third one.
If you're ready for another, here in the front, we can take a third.
Yes, and then we can,
Great.
and then I can attack with the answers. Yes, please go ahead.
It was me, I think.
You had,
Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, here.
Yes.
My name is Hector Ulloa. I am the president of the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund. So I want to ask a little bit related to this, like we're like sideline actors that are within the higher education community, but we're more like playing a support role. And we work a lot with aid projects with both higher education institutions, but also with student movements, teacher unions, and kind of the actors within the higher education community. And you mentioned in your talk a little bit about the difference between North and South. So maybe I wanted to ask you if you have some consideration around what's that role of these sideline actors that, for example, are engaging with aid in higher education. How can we then contribute to tackling these inequalities in all these different aspects or areas that you mentioned, if you had some thoughts on our role in this fight?
all right, okay.
Great questions.
Thank you very much for all the questions and attention. Going back to the first context in Australia, what I mentioned about the expectations of higher education doesn't mean that we need to give up thinking that higher education has a role to play. It's just about changing its role from what it has become, in your country as well, as an economic entity whose outcome is supposed to be employable, flexible employees. That's all we want. Compared to socially active, politically participating global citizens within the sustainable development era in which we are living. In Europe, I can go back to Europe, we have a rise of fascism, of populism, of divisions, inequalities that are now becoming labels. And we see political parties thriving on those. So what is the role of higher education in changing these? If we are not able to undo many of inequalities in the way students understand education, in the way that we treat them as part of our universities, then how are we going to change? There is a role for higher education. But what I meant to say was it needs to be transformed, and we need to understand that no miracle is going to happen at this very last phase of education. We need to have an integrative way of understanding that inequalities accumulate. And if students are not performing well in higher education, or if they are not going to the best courses or best fields that we want, it is not because they are not capable. No, it is because they have not had the opportunities throughout their lives, based on the informal setting of their families and the formal setting of our education systems. And I go back to, I would like to combine it with an answer to what you just mentioned about this obsessiveness that we have with assessment, rankings, assessments, which is in fact a vicious circle. It is creating a vicious circle for higher education, where it is just another business, just another entity, where teachers and professors are just another employer giving services, and the students are customers. That is the core thing that we need to change, and that is in fact what I have argued against in my book, which is going to be published, and you introduced it at the beginning. That approach, that neoliberal approach, which has turned our higher education into institutions that only have economic ends, that needs to be changed. Otherwise, we cannot go ahead. I mean, with sustainable development goals, through our pedagogies and through our institutional attitudes to sustainable development. In India, for example, you mentioned, sir, you are from India, yes? You're stationed in India. A global mandate. Yes, a global mandate in India. For example, online assessment is something that is blossoming in the Indian context. I'm sure you're aware of that. Online assessment, so preparing the students for assessment. What does that change in their attitudes in life? How does that make them global citizens? How does it help sustainable development? These are the questions that we need to ask about our higher education and try to change it. I think that is a vicious circle. This managerial attitude towards higher education is something that we need to change and do away with. With your question in front, which was about the role of students' associations, I think, in the Global
South.
South.
Projects and the North-South divide,
yes.
And then silent actors, I think, was an important point you raised.
Yes, well, that is exactly. That is another topic that I'm presenting within the next 2 months, and I have created a new conceptual framework, which I'm hoping to be applied to reality. And that is about having circular societies, where accountability, discussion, democratic exchange can undo all the inequalities that are unheard of. There are times that the students are suffering from inequalities, but we never hear them. There are inequalities that are affecting academics. I mean, after all, we are all doomed with this publish or perish of the rankings that is imposed on us. We are living on short-term contracts in academia as well. We are overloaded with much work without being paid for it decently. Precariousness of academics is one of the latest OECD publications, and I do invite you to go and take a look at it. So there are inequalities that are unheard of, and our policies and practices do not allow them to be heard, which is why I propose circular societies where institutions, macro level policymakers, and individuals can gather to talk, to discuss, to deny, and to change. That's the only way, I think. Otherwise, yes, many of the voices would go unheard, as they have been till now. And thank you for your questions.
Absolutely. We have time for a couple more if you'd like to raise your hand. Dr. Chanita? A question here in the middle. And yes, we'll take 2 more questions, and then we might be just out of time if you think we can address after the session as well.
True.
And online, please feel free to keep your questions coming
I'll
online.
be available with all pleasure outside if we need
Bonjour
to.
tout le monde.
Bonjour.
Morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Fatima Taraba. I come from Guinea Civil Society. Thank you very much, madam, for your presentation. It's true, I've learned to take the train in place. And so, in the presentation, you said that you had your research, you went through 13 universities, 9 countries. Yes? I want to know who is in charge of your research. Did you have touch in the only African countries? If it is yes, if it's sub-Saharan African, and if it does form part or not. And if it hasn't, I hope that you will, if you did not look at sub-Saharan factories, I hope in the future you will include sub-Saharan African countries. Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, no, our research project concerning European, is only about European countries and financed by the European Union. And so we were not lucky enough to work on the policies and practices in African countries, something I did of my own bat, via my own projects, my own research. So I'd love to talk with you about this issue. So thank you very much. So we continue. We're not there yet, but we will get there concerning future products.
It is a very interesting presentation. In the beginning, you mentioned that inequality comprises of access in terms of access and in terms of quality, right?
No. Access and opportunities.
And opportunity. And also, I think inequality must have another dimension, that is quality education. I wonder in your model, Micah, I can't remember the name, and the Pioneer Education Project, how could we achieve equality in terms of quality of education?
In terms of quality of education. All right, okay, yes. Well, part of policies and practices that focus on equality of opportunities are in fact focusing on quality of practice, for example, in classroom, in order to provide the kind of pedagogies or enabling environments for everyone where all the students, regardless of their backgrounds, could actually thrive. That is in theory. In practice, it doesn't happen. In practice, in the schools, another part of our research, for example, has shown that perceptions of teachers, of the background of the students, does have an impact on the way they treat them. There is gender divide in the way that teachers treat students. I'll give you a very straightforward example. Have a boy and a girl in the same class, and both of them saying, oh, teacher, sorry, I have a stomachache. The attitude of the teacher usually towards the boy would be, hey, man up, sit down. To the girl, when we say, oh, I'm really sorry, go. That's one. In other places, we may think that, oh, okay, this girl is not paying attention, she has too much makeup, she's not wearing the proper dress. No, out, okay, I'm not going to pay attention to you. The students that sit in front of the class attract more attention compared to those who sit at the back. And why do they sit in the back? Because they don't understand. Some of them have special needs that we don't understand and we do not address. Some of them are hard of hearing. Some of them are dyslexic. There are different things that we do not, so yes, I understand. That is another thing that I'm very passionate about, quality of education. And for that, there are teacher trainings, there are toolkits. But again, it comes down to the individual attitude of teachers, particularly as around the world we have lack of teachers. That is UNESCO's latest report. And to compensate for that, we hire subject specialists, people who are graduated from physics, chemistry, whatever topic that they have studied, and without any training on pedagogy, we put them in the classroom in front of the students. Short-term contracts, just substitute. Sometimes in countries I have worked, and I go back to Sierra Leone, for example, where I have worked, you have 120 students in one class with one teacher. Impossible to teach. In another African country that I have worked, for example, Côte d'Ivoire, or another one, you do not have textbooks for everyone. Textbooks are kept by the teacher. There is one we share with 50 students. So you see, all these accumulations and the social gender divides, where we expect boys to be breadwinners and girls to marry off and have children and be happy and all that. That still exists and persists, not only in the mentality of teachers, but also mentality of families and the students themselves. So quality would be a very blurry, far away thing. There are efforts, I know there are, and there are many good practices. I can share one experience that I had very shortly in one developing country where, despite all the shortcomings, a primary teacher created songs with each one of the alphabets. And her students, regardless of their backgrounds, they loved her and they learned without exception. So it comes down really to individual practice and translation of policies into practice.
Let's thank Juliette again for her talk on Is Higher Education Doomed with Inequalities? Yes, unless we transform and address this accumulation of inequality. Really profound starting points for the World Higher Education Conference. Please join me in thanking Juliette.
Thank you for listening.
We'll take a short break and we'll start again in a couple of minutes with our next session. Please stay with us. Thanks. That was really outstanding. I really think you outstanding. I think I'm still on mic, but great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to it.